This lesson is on Southern Africa, and this is part 4 of a 4-part series on Africa in the post-classical period. And one of the challenges of doing the history of Southern Africa in the post-classical world is just really the challenge of literacy and history, right? Because what is the history of a people who leave no writing? And how do we do the history of a people when they live in an area that rapidly degrades artifacts such as wooden masks? We have to make a lot of inferences about the history of Southern Africa. It was not connected to the Arabic and Muslim networks in the ways that the Swahili coast and Western and Northern Africa were. And so, the history of this time period in this area is much less detailed and much more difficult to grasp than those other parts of Africa, right? Southern Africa had very limited contact with the outside world. And part of that is because of the winds and currents of the southwestern African coasts. There's really just kind of a current block right here at the corner at the Bight of Benin that ships could sail south very easily and they could sail north very easily, but it's very difficult to get right through this area here. And it would take centuries before Europeans had the sailing technology to get around this area. You also have very dense jungles right through here that kind of broke off contact with West Africa. And, over here on the Swahili coast, there's also, these jungles and very difficult deserts here as well. So this whole Southern African region was much more cut off and isolated than the other parts of Africa at this time period. And so that isolation, really led to lower technology. Humans don't develop technology on their own. They're constantly trading ideas and developments. And so the people who are in a position to learn from 2 or 3 different groups, people like the Indians, the Arabs, and the Europeans who are, in contact with 2 or 3 other groups constantly, their technology advances much faster than an area like Southern Africa where the people are kind of cut off. You may notice I didn't mention China. You may notice I didn't mention China in that last list, and that's because the Chinese have always just developed tons of technology on their own. They really are the technology incubators of the world and always have been. And so this area just really didn't have a whole lot of contact, and when they finally did get contact with Europe, it was mainly slave raiding. All right, but nonetheless, we can look at some of the major groups of this time period and in this area. The first one I want to look at is the Yoruba people. And we do know of this area as being inhabited by the so-called Nok culture of modern-day Nigeria that dates back to the 5th century BCE, but we don't see a major reorganization in that area until about 1000 CE with the Yoruba people. And they developed small city-states that just had, basically about 50-mile radius around them. Remember, a city-state is the city itself as well as the farmlands that are controlled by the city around the outside. Usually we think about the Greek city-states, and that analogy would be appropriate here. And so the Yoruba more had like tribal kings who were in charge of these ethnic groups that also had their own city-states. They were seen as semi-divine, and Yoruba civilization was highly urban. Like I said, these very small cities as well as their immediate farmlands. The next group that developed again in southern Africa were the people of Benin, and they were very culturally similar to the Yoruba, and they were organized in very similar ways. And they started organizing city-states in the 14th century CE, and they're known for their highly artistic achievements. This mask here is a very well-known mask, interestingly enough, because it has images of Portuguese sailors around the top of it. This African king is wearing the faces of these Portuguese. Early on, the African kings of Western and Central and Southern Africa saw themselves as highly superior to the Europeans. They were on home field. They had home field advantage. The Europeans, like the Portuguese, came in very humbly at first. And so it's kind of an interesting backstory on this artifact here. And like I said, they were some of the first people to have contact with the Europeans, but this is before the period of the African slave trade, before that period really began. Going further south into modern-day Congo, this was the early kingdom of Congo, often spelled with a K. This was a very small coastal kingdom, again organized by tribes, and they were, river to coast traders. So they would bring things along the river networks from the interior jungles out to the coast. These are things like ivory and woods and things like that, and they were successful because they had iron weapons. But you're going to keep in mind that they're going to come up against the Europeans who have steel weapons as well as early cannons and guns. But nevertheless, Congo was very powerful in the period of early contact with Europe. But they were a loose confederation of smaller kingdoms or city-states, again, very similar to the Yoruba and the Benin. Moving further eastward now, to the location of the Great Zimbabwe. And this shouldn't be confused with the nation of Zimbabwe, which is a modern nation in Africa. Same sort of thing, right? These smaller local tribal kingdoms. They're well known for building these spiraling fortress-like structures and really remarkable engineering. These things were often 30 feet tall and built without mortar. So the kind of stone cutting and sculpting and design that it takes to build structures like this without mortar is very, very sophisticated. And, at the time they were starting to build a network of smaller kingdoms into a regional power, but never really went much further than that. And so, final notes here, right? Geographic isolation from the world network proved costly for the people of southern and southwestern Africa. And we're going to see this repeated when we study the people of the Pacific and the Americas. Again, geographic isolation tends to lead to lower technology, which then when a higher technology civilization comes along, those people are at a great disadvantages. And, we looked at this in period 2 of world history, when we looked at the relationship between the Romans and the German peoples, right? So this isn't an ethnic or a racial thing, as some racists have tried to make it. The people of Africa were just as intelligent as the people of Europe and Arabia and India, but it's this geographic isolation that causes these STEM imbalances and economic disadvantages, and then there's a military difference, and then a people are ripe for enslavement, capture, or defeat. So you probably notice here the pattern of much smaller civilization groups, much smaller communities of people in southern Africa. And again, a lot of it has to do with geography more than anything else. So that's it. Thanks for watching.